on this computer. Okay, so, all right, so I'm going to start out with a almost with like a bank shot. One of my favorite ways of classifying labor markets or classifying jobs is to put them into three groups. And I really wish that the Bureau of Labor Statistics would help with collecting or classifying jobs by these three groups, but they don't. One is jobs that work with things. Another is jobs that work with people. And the third is jobs that work with symbols. So things, people, or symbols. So the jobs that work with things are things like agricultural labor, manufacturing production work, construction, transportation, things like that. Jobs that work with people would be things like teaching, social work, childcare, things like that. And jobs that work with symbols would be things like software development, most fields of entertainment and arts and the arts are working with symbols. So anyway, I like that classification approach, even though there certainly are some jobs that combine things and might be hard to classify that way. Just in my lifetime, and I'm 68 years old, there has been a tremendous, staggering change in the relative proportions of those jobs in the economy. The jobs working with things have gone way down. I would say probably when I was born in 1954, at least 2/3 of the jobs in the economy were working with things, and probably even a higher percentage of the jobs that men were working on were working with things. So that there was just a very high probability that if a male was in the workforce, he was working with things. And I think the total proportion of people working with symbols was probably small. Maybe I'll throw out a number like 10 or 15%. So today, I think, maybe I'm under a false impression, but I think the percentage of symbols jobs is at least 30%. And I'm sure that the percentage of people working in things, working with things, those jobs has gone way down. Maybe under 40% now, something like that. So that's a very interesting topic in and of itself, but I bring it up here to say that Zeihan, and I think that's actually how he pronounces his name. I think everyone has a different way of pronouncing it, but I think that's what he does, is really focused on the world of things. So there's a chapter on agriculture, there's a chapter on manufacturing, there's a chapter on energy. There is no chapter on finance or software development. He doesn't approach those the same way. So it's a real corrective to, I think, how a lot of us view the world, because a lot of us tend to view it mostly through the world of jobs with symbols. And we often forget about the world of jobs with things and where things come from and how we get them. And so I think it's a very, if people read the book for nothing else, they should read it to realize that things still matter, that even though fewer people work with them, how we get them is still very important. And one specific example is, I think, in the area of green technology. No one mentioned that as an issue, but every time it comes up, he pretty much denigrates green technology, even though he's a big believer in that we should worry about climate change. And I think it's maybe the most concise and powerful takedown of the illusions that people have about green technology that I've ever read. In short, he says that, let's say, take the United States. In the Northeast United States, in the Washington-Boston corridor, about a third of our population is in that corridor. Almost, so he says that the difference between fossil fuel energy and wind and solar energy is that fossil fuels are very dense and very concentrated. So regardless of where they are, we have the means and the infrastructure to transport fossil fuel energy to where our people are, to where this 100 million people on the Northeast corridor are. We do not have the means or the infrastructure to transport energy from the Great Plains, where the wind might be, or the Southwest, where the solar power might be. So, at this point, we don't even know how to do that. But let's assume we knew we knew technically how to move the energy to where the people are. The process of doing that, of building that infrastructure, would involve so much mining, so much construction, so much manufacturing, all of which would create lots and lots of carbon dioxide emissions, that you're almost defeating the purpose of switching to those forms of energy. So anyway, I took that out of the various comments he made about clean energy, and I can easily imagine that most of us who live in the world of symbols don't think in those terms and don't think about what the people who work with things would have to do to make a transition to solar power and wind power possible. So anyway, I thought that was actually one of the big takeaways I got from the book. I think people have pointed to the two. Okay, let me say, and another takeaway is that international trade and globalization really matter. That you cannot you can agree. It's easy to disagree with his scenarios in which the world breaks up into separate trading blocks. You can disagree with whether that will happen, but I think he makes a very persuasive case that if it did happen, a lot of people would be a lot poorer as a result. And I think if anything, he underestimates how much poorer Americans would be as a result of the loss of the ability to integrate with China and with other countries. So it's I wrote this book, Specialization in Trade, which talks at a very high level about how important it is that we are able to specialize and trade with each other. And I think Zeihan really, really makes that clear at a more concrete level. What by talking about what deglobalization would mean, he really brings home how important specialization and trade are. So those are kind of two takeaways: the takeaway about green energy, the takeaway about the importance of trade. He has, and people have mentioned this already, two drivers of of a, this of a decline in globalization, or a decline in many countries. One of them is the collapse of the order, particularly the order on the seas. That is, um, he claims that after the Second World War, the United States was motivated a little bit by sort of a economic imperialism and a lot by fear of the Soviet bloc to create a big free trade zone patrolled by the U.S. Navy, and that the U.S. is just no longer interested in that for a variety of reasons. So that's one reason that the order will change. And the other is what several people mentioned, demographics, that basically in every continent except Africa, it's headed toward depopulation. We're going to, as Tom pointed out, Japan is kind of the leading edge of this, where, a huge proportion of the people in Japan are well past retirement age. And other countries, China, Zion claims, is the fastest aging country in the entire world. And so he, is very pessimistic there. He doesn't mention Africa. I've seen other demographic reports that suggest that Africa will be, an overwhelming majority of the world's population, 50 to 75 years from now. So, well, if we discuss demographics, I don't think we can leave out, some kind of forecast for what will happen vis-a-vis Africa in that regard. My one comment about demographics is that they move slowly. I think it's really kind of bizarre to talk about an imminent collapse of China because, based on demographics. I don't care, I don't care how fast demographics are moving relative to history. It's just not something that over a 2, 3, 5-year time frame I see making such a big difference. And human beings being what they are, I forget which one of you brought up the idea of adaptation, but humans adapt, and I think we should be one of the first things we should be talking about when we discuss demographics is how humans will end up adapting to demographic change. And so, when somebody, I forget who mentioned that, Japan might be the leading edge, watch what Japan does. I mean, is Japan able to continue to survive with its huge debt to GDP ratio, government debt to GDP ratio? Do robots take over in Japan, and does that provide a leading edge? So that, that's an interesting question there. Regarding the other issue of the disorder, I think somebody raised the question of, haven't we learned anything in the last 75 years? And other people raised the point of, China needs the order more than we do, if you believe Zion, right? Because we're relatively self-sufficient in energy and food. And if you include the Western Hemisphere, we've got a sufficient labor force to last us quite a while. And if you read Zion, if somebody blocks the Persian Gulf, the lights go out in China. That doesn't happen in the U.S. And if there's problems transporting food, the Chinese will starve. So he's got all these bearish implications for China of deglobalization. And as some people raise the point here, well, if it's in their interest for the order to be maintained, why in the world would they be trying to undermine America? And that's, I think a fair question. And I think one of the things that we're going to see with the Ukraine war will be a real test of whether economic sanctions, A, can succeed in breaking up globalization, and B, can be maintained as a policy, a desired policy. In the early 1970s, wage and price controls were discredited. They were tried as a way of stopping inflation and were discredited. And one possible outcome of the sanctions regime is that in a couple years, we'll say, hey, this is not working. We're, if Zion is right, we're going to cause a lot of starvation, a lot of misery. The Europeans might vote out all the governments who impose sanctions once they, are freezing the whole winter, and food prices are going through the roof. So we don't, anyway, that's the casual assumption that Zion makes that the US will just walk away from the order and, and everyone else will just start fighting for their local, the local scraps that they can get. It's not a rational outcome. It isn't, we know in game theory, we don't necessarily get the positive sum outcomes. Sometimes you get the negative sum outcome, you get the prisoner's dilemma type of outcome. But certainly it's conceivable we wouldn't get that. I would say that, I've said before that I feel like a war profiteer, and that some of my investment portfolio, which was intended merely to protect against inflation, the inflation that I thought was coming from too much stimulus and silly COVID policies. And that portfolio did very well in the first couple months of the invasion. So I feel like a war profiteer. I think Zion might be a war profiteer as well, in that this war is such a strong move in the direction that he predicted about disorder, and took so many people by surprise that I think Zion. I think that's a big reason that the book, as you may have heard, it has showed up within the top 20 on the New York Times bestseller list. I think just because no one else was talking about a world where we'd have an old-fashioned war and so on. And that brings up one of the other topics that somebody said, what is Putin thinking? And it appears to be that, well, the Wall Street Journal piece, I don't know if everyone else has read it or how many people read the journal, but and it's just by a Wall Street Journal correspondent. I don't know what his background is. Or what his biases are, but his view is that Putin really is, almost like an 18th century, 19th century figure who thinks that Russia deserves this large expanded empire. Zion's view is that it's more of a sort of a defensive, historical view that Russia was easily invaded over the plains of Poland and Ukraine, or could easily be cut off from the sea in the West, and has just a strong need to protect its access to the sea, and it needs a deep a deep frontier, a frontier that's far from its capitals to protect itself. Now that's, again, that seems odd if you believe, as I think most of us do, that nobody in the West is interested in launching another Napoleon or Hitler-like attack on Russia. Let me just let me just walk through a couple of the other questions. So what is what about nuclear weapons in a Zion world? And I think in a Zion world where people no longer expect the United States to keep order, I think the likelihood of countries procuring nuclear weapons and using them seems to me is bound to go up. I don't know how many people are fans of Tom Lehrer, the 1960s satirical singer, but he had this song called "Who's Next?" And I won't recite the whole song, but it's sort of about which country gets the bomb, and this is one part of it is Egypt's gonna get one too, just to use on you know who. So Israel's getting tense, wants one in self-defense. Anyway,
the Lord's our shepherd, says the psalm, but just in case, we better get a bomb.
Yeah. So I think that's a fair worry, and it doesn't get any mention in Zion's book, and that's kind of unfortunate. It'll be up to us to figure that one out, I guess. And another question: are we seeing relocalization? And again, I'm not sure. I think I'm just not sure how much the sanctions are sticking, how much the supply chains are permanently broken or in the process of being repaired. So, but that is a really interesting question. Are we seeing a rehearsal of Zion world, or are we seeing only a, sort of a temporary, small scale version of it that's not, I don't think we've really hit Zion world yet. I mean, you can still buy iPhones, I don't think we've hit it yet. Somebody mentioned all the dire predictions about China. Are they extreme? He talks about a 50% population drop by 2050, so it's like a little less than 30 years. But even so, I mean, China can afford a big drop in population, and 30 years is a long time in terms of technological change, sort of Moore's law type change over 30 years. It's not, I wouldn't bet that scenario is impossible for China to deal with. And yeah, and I think, again, I think cutting in half in 30 years is a lot different. The pace on an annual basis is not fast, and I don't see a near-term collapse of China based on that. But we can talk more about sort of why he thinks the near-term outlook for China is so bad. Somebody raised the question about the assumption that labor productivity will end at 65. I think that's exactly the one of the big questions to ask, because uh, you know, one scenario is that the biotech revolution will not just extend life, but extend quality of life. And you know, what are you going to do if you're 65 years old and the you know the medical technology is available to extend your life to 200 years old and to extend your working ability, just about that long? Are you got, it seems to me that if that kind of biotech revolution comes, that's bound to change certainly the age at which you become a dependent on the government, and probably the retirement age. Okay, I think I've at least touched briefly on all the issues people said. So now I think I'll do a more open-ended thing. So Lee's got a hand up. So you want to go ahead and...
Sure. Thanks. I thought that was really thoughtful and helpful. Thanks for all the ideas you laid out. There was something you said close to the end that jumped out at me and is sort of in line with the topic I'm most fascinated by, which is, you mentioned how 30 years is a very long time, and China may have extraordinary technological progress during that period of time. I guess the question that I'm trying to figure out is, just as Malthusian predictions that the world would run out of food and that we had too many people, those predictions proved to be completely off base time and again. So I'm trying to figure out, are we making that same mistake here or not? Are these predictions that things are going to be bad, whether in China or Japan or other places with bad demographics, or are we missing some vital facet whether it's technological change or something else that's going to change how things play out, such that in 30 years, the argument made now that China's got declining demographics and demographics are destiny will seem quaint in some way? That's what I'm trying to solve for. And I don't know the answer. I'm not asking this because I know the answer. I'm asking it because I genuinely am hoping that others will have interesting ideas here that will help influence my thinking.
Okay, the next hand up is Tom. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm wondering if it's possible to share the screen so you can look at what Zeihan says about Italy. He's got 4 great population graphs of Italy 1950, Italy 1995, Italy 2020, and Italy 2040. And you can kind of see that. Let me try to do that. I don't know if you allow. No, you've disabled that.
Yeah, if it, yeah, maybe if you, okay, all right. I think if I make you a co-host for a period of time, we can do that. Let me see if I can do that. Hang on.
Okay, well, and the point is, as we talk about Italy, which we see, we don't see the similar things for Japan, which I think are even more extreme, and China, which is maybe 20 years behind Japan. And so I really do think that we don't know socially what's going to happen, but I'm certain that Japan's going to be supporting its older people with a lot more robots and robot assistants. And I know they're already selling a lot more diapers for retired people than diapers for babies. That's been happening for 10 years now in Japan.
Yeah, I think that the challenge, I think the demographic future, if you just tell me that people are going to get older, the population is going to age, I get very pessimistic. If you tell me that we're going to discover cures for aging as a disease, I think it's a completely different story. And I think that's really the issue. You know,
Yeah, but I don't think that's going to happen. I think what we might happen is that almost all of the current aging diseases will be suppressed so that you at 68 can be healthy and productive for another 10 years. Whereas your father at 68 was really quite retired oriented.
yeah.
And I'm at 66, so that's what I'm hoping for also.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. When I was uh, back when I started teaching high school around the early 2000s, I had been reading. I don't know if anyone's here has heard of Aubrey de Grey. I heard of him first because he was an Othello player, and I was also a tournament player. But he's part he his he's been sort of in the forefront of anti-aging, even though he doesn't really have a biology background. He just says, just as an autodidact, he's figured out stuff, and there are 8 ways that people die, and he has an engineer's mindset. He brings an engineer's mindset to the biology problems. There are 8 ways that cells age or go bad, and we just have to find the ways to curate all 8 of those, and then it'll be like replacing the engine in a car to keep it going. So that he was one of the first to sort of believe in anti-aging. The most famous person to believe in it is Ray Kurzweil, who I described to my students as entrepreneur, engineer, and head case. But I do think that regardless of what you think the probability of the scenario is, a scenario in which we can be kept going the way a car can be kept going forever is a very, very different scenario than one in which the population ages and all of the sort of diseases and degeneracies that currently exist are still around. Okay, so Richard, do you want to give your thought?
Yes, yes. Perhaps one aspect that Zeihan doesn't really comment about in detail would be cultural differences. And this may have an effect or be important for looking at issues of aging in society and patterns that promote healthy aging. And there's several factors. One would be just the social setting. If there's isolation, it's more difficult for the aged. If there's some type of social network, it's less difficult. That's one aspect. There's another aspect, which is just patterns of health, obesity, tremendous public health problem that we have. Not other cultures have that. Japan and China don't have it to the same degree that we have, or very little now. So he didn't really address how cultural resilience and social resilience might affect his predictions.
Yeah. I started out by saying, he talks about the world of things, and in that sense, it's kind of the opposite of one of the books that I co-authored, which was about the importance of intangibles in the economy. First of all, institutions make a huge difference, and ideas make a huge difference. And I think what I've been suggesting is that over the long run, I think ideas will matter relative to demographics. But I think you're making a fair point that that institutions will matter relative to demographics. For all his negatives on China, he doesn't talk that much about the difference between, sort of a, a free market system and their sort of government-run quasi-capitalist, whatever you call their system, course, maybe the differences aren't as large as I'm making them out. But that most people when they talk about America versus China, they don't think about, oh, well, we've got the Mississippi River and we've got the Great Plains and we've got the places where we do fracking. Most people think about it in terms of our systems of government and the economy as being a difference. But again, I think that it's nice to have Zeihan as a reminder that things do matter. But he is so deterministic about that. It's as if America was bound to be what it was simply because of our river network and our sort of fertile land and available oil. John A., you have to unmute.
Yes, a follow-up on ideas. If I understand correctly, key economists who have thought about this, Paul Romer and Julian Simon and others, they hold the view that ideas depend upon population, so that I guess it's a version of the scope of the extent of the market argument. More people, greater scope of markets, more ideas, higher quality in entrepreneurship, better, higher chance of very high productivity, genius and leader, and so on. So it might be that demographic decline will also cause a decline in the output of very productive ideas.
Yeah, that's definitely a Paul Romer view, is that there are positive economies of population increase just because more people lead to more ideas. Now that's a very mechanistic view, and you could imagine a world in which sort of it's quality of people, not quantity of people, or anything. But that's it's a really but that would be a mechanism by which this depopulation would be would slow down growth, if you think it's just strictly a numbers game. I have a hard time myself thinking of it as strictly a numbers game. I think that institutions, including softer institutions, cultural norms, and John A., I'm sure you're aware of those arguments, the Deirdre McCloskey argument and so on, that it's the culture and institutional surroundings that sort of make it possible for ideas to increase productivity growth. Yeah, Lee.
So that logic makes sense, right? That you could innovate your way out of the demographic headwind, because innovation can create economic value or productivity growth, and that will potentially, if it's some great innovation, right? If you're creating Google or something, that's enough to make up for the headwind. But it feels like that's both a big gamble and one that gets harder to expect as that demographic headwind keeps moving against you. Because like you said, Arnold, you'll have fewer people means fewer ideas generated, and you're less likely to have that one lucky one that I guess turns into the next Google or Amazon or something like that.
Yeah, Drea, did you want to?
I'll do my +1 on this topic. I think that seems like an opportunity for innovation there. I was actually, in terms of how it goes back to the progress studies space of, do we need fewer people to come up with good ideas? Do you have machine learning generated ideation and innovation and stuff like that? So I think that's where you have a crux opportunity. If folks are done with that topic, the other one, the question that I had was, do we absolutely believe his Zion's theory that piracy is going to make transport undoable?
Yeah, that really, he thinks, you know, he almost writes it as if it's given that at some point, you know, China won't be able to get oil out of the Persian Gulf, that you know, countries that need to import food won't be able to, and so on. It's like he sees that world as if it's out there now, and it is a little hard to imagine. Again, he benefits by the fact that you had the Russia-Ukraine war, which is like, you know, sort of 1/3 of what he was expecting. You know, sort of the other 1/3 is a battle in the South China Sea between Japan and China, right? I think he sort of sees that. You know, he keeps saying that Japan has a navy with a longer range, a longer striking range than China, and so, you know, Japan will have an easier time feeding and feeding itself and keeping the lights on. And I guess the Middle East is the third flashpoint. I mean, it's pretty easy to picture things blowing up there. You know, one question is there a sort of a contradiction between his demographic view and his view that you know, things are going to become more violent and warlike? Because one view of demographics is that it's really an excess of young men that is correlated with war, and if that's true, then you would expect less on those terms. And I think people have like, you know, people have noticed that Russia doesn't have the kind of military force that they had in the 1940s. You know, in the 1940s, they could just keep throwing divisions after divisions after divisions into the fight, and now they, you know, they're really having trouble, you know, finding men and making up for losses. So that would suggest that we'll have a more peaceful period going forward, not have the kind of anarchy and piracy and local wars breaking out that Zeihan predicts. All right, John A.
A follow-up on that. Is it a strength or instead a weakness that Zeihan places such emphasis on historical knowledge? His projections often are also often assertions that a previous trend will reassert itself. So, for example, China was on the way to fragmentation in the 19th and early 20th century. That was interrupted by events in the 20th century, but that long-term pattern or trend or process will return. And the same with Russia, you know, with the interpretation of Putin as a kind of 18th or 19th century figure, and these longue durée interpretations of the psychology of defense and leadership and so on in Russia. So I'm going on, but what I'm you know, is it a strength or is it a weakness that which is it that he you know, even though demography has changed so much, he still puts a lot of stock in previous historical trends or processes reasserting themselves.
Yeah, I think that goes back to his putting so much emphasis on the world of things, of energy, uh, of food and fuel. So, um, so once you do that, in some sense, geography uh, becomes destiny because of, again, his view of America is that we've got this great transportation network. We've got this neighbor Mexico that happens to have sort of some complementary factors of production and so on. And China doesn't, so he views that, I think he would view China's inability to maintain a stable regime as kind of a geography is destiny for them. And maybe this is a case of overestimating the importance of things and physical things, and that it could be that uh, that the evolution of culture and politics in China makes that regime not as fragile as the historical Chinese regimes were. Yeah. Okay, Gary, go ahead. You're muted. You're going to have to unmute before you. There you go.
I think one area not covered in progress studies and not technological and not related to Moore's law is actually changes in social policy. And I think this gets back to Tom's comments about Japan. And that is, Abe had major labor reforms to allow immigration. So there's more than 10,000 immigrants a year going into Japan now. So they don't need robots because they have Philippine nurses. And they don't necessarily need as many Japanese factory workers because they're importing them from Vietnam. And that is a real cultural change, I think, for Japan. These people have a path to permanent residency. They're not temporary workers. And so I think that's one of the things here. Demographics will do what they're going to do, but you can move it around, a good bit. And if we're going to use Japan as the leading example, I think that's a good thing to keep in mind.
Yeah. And that that gets back to the point that there are going to be so many people, so much of the world's population in the next 50 years is going to be born in Africa, and if countries, I mean, either Africa is going to have to develop on its own, which is, I think, frankly, a little, I'd be skeptical of, and in part because Africa's got its geographic problems. Its rivers are not navigable. Much of the country is inland and doesn't have ocean aspect. I mean, as Zion points out, water transport is just a heck of a lot cheaper than overland transport. So let's say Africa doesn't develop, then there'll be this huge supply of people, needing to work and be fed, and there'll be these countries that are emptying out. So the countries that can import and assimilate the African population would seem to have a big advantage. Yeah, Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the assimilation is really crucial, and it's going to be very interesting in Japan, where the Shinto religion is kind of a worship of ancestors and Japanness. America is not completely unique, but everybody in the world, in theory, could become an American. I've been living in Slovakia for 30 years. I am not now and will never be a Slovak. And even if I speak Slovak, and I still make grammatical mistakes, but I do speak it, I'll never be a Slovak. My kids are both. They're both Slovaks and Americans. There's going to be some more of that, but the in favor of Zion's idea that America is going to be walking away from the rest of the world of problems without the Pax Americana, I think is actually pretty strong. But I don't think the rest of the world problems are really going to be as big problems as Zion thinks they are. And as you mentioned with the demographics, if the rich countries are hollowing out to some extent, that's certainly going to be reducing the housing crisis, and it's going to be reducing the resource requirements. So, yeah, hundreds of millions of people are being born in Africa, and that is going to be an issue. But I think that Zion is over Cassandra-like in his prophecies of doom, but trying to warn us, like Cassandra was trying to warn the Greeks, with some catastrophic scenarios which could be avoided by better social policies, better US Navy military policies, maybe better AI training policies. I remember 5 years ago, I was at IBM and I wanted their big AI Watson to be teaching English. Probably English is the most paid for schooling all over the world, but people are paying money to get more English training. And by the way, if you're an American or American youngster and you want to go anywhere in the world, you can still find a job as an English teacher almost everywhere else. But the Watson folk decided to teach psychology and to teach Sesame Street instead. Okay, but I do think there's a lot of opportunity for AI as an example, and with care of older people as an example, but also immigration as a demographic adjustment.
Okay. So Drea, is that enough adaptation for you? Okay. John A., do you have a
I would just looking at birth rates in Africa, and World Bank data and Statista both show that the birth rate has been declining at a constant rate at a I guess you'd say at a constant rate since 1985 in Africa. Now it's still, it started at a very high level, almost 7%, but it's and it's still twice the replacement rate, but it's just above 4 now. And if this trend should this trend continue, the Africa hypothesis, I think, would be diminished or muted.
Yeah, I don't know. I thought the projections took account of the downward trend in the birth rates, but I could be wrong. Anyone else have comment on this issue, or want to raise these issues, or want to raise others? Yeah, so I think again, I think it's really valuable to go through the thought experiment of a relocalization of what these countries would look like if international trade were to collapse. But I think we've pointed out that people have strong incentives to keep it going, and I'll be interested to see whether those incentives are strong enough that countries sort of pull back from the brink that they're seeing right now with sanctions and with the war in Russia and Ukraine. I think people raised a really interesting question of sort of why Russia and China, of all countries, if Zion is right, that these are two countries that really need international trade badly. Like Russia can't get money any other way by selling oil. It's a petro state. China can't get food or energy any other way but by trade, why in the world would they not want to see the preservation of what Zion calls the order? I think that's just a very interesting question. And, I think one of a number of reasons to sort of doubt that his scenario of a breakup into piracy and local conflicts will come about. But again, so far it's working out his way. Yes, Johnny?
What about the, one side effect of the Ukraine conflict has been rapprochement between Russia and China. And on the economic dimension, Russia can provide energy and food to China in exchange for, things. So it's not, obviously it's less efficient and complete than full globalization, but the two big countries with a lot of weapons that need international trade have found each other.
Yeah. Well, Zion would say that Russia needs more than sort of the products of China, that Russia's infrastructure requires American know-how. If his discussion of how how Russia's energy production works, that it's really thanks to American know-how and the American corporations in Russia to keep the oil flowing. And that if the American engineers aren't there, sooner or later, the whole system will break down. So that would be I think his response there. And I think he doesn't think that Russia has enough surplus food to feed China either. And so that I think that he would say doesn't work either. And I mean, one thing that we haven't mentioned about his pessimism about China is he just thinks that they've as you know, I think we've printed a lot of paper wealth in this country, that that the government printed a lot of paper wealth that wasn't in some sense backed by anything real. He thinks that they've printed about 10 times as much as we have. And so at some point, if that's right, that the inflation in China will just reach catastrophic levels. So that he's got a lot of reasons why he's pessimistic on China, and even if some of them turn out to be right, I think he may well be right there. Yeah, Tom?
Yeah, but on the China stuff, as John was talking about, not just China and Russia, but also India. And India is happy to buy Russia oil discounted. And so, as you mentioned, Russia's selling, but we haven't really quite talked about the price of oil. Well, under Trump, it was $50 a barrel. Now it's about 100, but only, what was it, 12, 14 years ago in the 2008 crisis, it was $150 a barrel. So it's not like the world hasn't seen $150 a barrel. And there are oil experts predicting 130 to 150 coming, but that won't be a huge shock that's never before seen.
Yeah.
But the thing I want to mention is that China and Russia and India and maybe the other BRICS countries of Brazil and South Africa, but also you can think of it as the non-American dominated countries. China and Russia are trying to create an alternate non-US dollar-based financial system of global trade. And to a large extent, I expect this Russia-Ukraine war however the borders finalize, one of the movements is going to be the localization of the production of things, but it's also going to be a regionalization of some financial a BRICS kind of international alternative reserve currency to the US dollar, which in 20 or 50 years could very well become the biggest weakness of America as a result. And then again, it might not.
I would amend that to say it either happens over the next 5 years or it doesn't, would be my guess. And there are a number of challenges with that. But I think, I mean, if Zion is right that China is, just on the verge of collapse, then it will not be, then an alternative financial system that depends a lot on China isn't going to emerge. And if China can't be one of the anchors of an alternative financial system, I don't think Russia or India have the ability, because China, they don't, the size of their economies are just.
I don't see China collapsing,
Yeah.
despite looking at the 10 times more debt that they have, and the upcoming Congress, and how much of a dictator Xi is going to be in the future. He was not very enthusiastic, it seems to me, about this Putin expansion of the borders. The psychological issues, why China is competing with America to a large extent. It's also why is Russia, and that is, in my view, kind of clearly there's a big intangible interest. I'm reading this, I just read this book, Why We Fight, about the roots of war and the paths to peace, by Chris Blattman. That was recommended by Tyler. And the second reason is intangible incentives. And their incentive, both of them, as well as India, is to be a competing superpower. And, it's like the Avis ad, we're number 2, we try harder. China's trying to do that. And the Chinese people, especially the Han majority, very homogenous Han majority and racist, they are proud of China's advances. And how do they exhibit this pride? I think this is part of Xi's stuff, where he wants to make a credible threat to compete with America, but he doesn't want to fight and lose.
Yeah, well, that's sort of the Belt and Road Initiative certainly is very consistent with that impression of China.
Arnold, you mentioned that the stability and scope of sanctions are being tested by the Ukraine conflict. I read today that senior officials, perhaps in the State Department, have asked to lift sanctions on Iran and Venezuela, presumably because if you have sanctions against everybody, it's too much to manage.
Well, if you have sanctions against all the oil producers,
yeah.
No, I mean, a lot of politicians are going to be thrown out of office if the price of gasoline keeps going up. And Tom may be right that this isn't unprecedented in terms of oil prices, but it's still enough to cause a lot of pain. And again, it'll be interesting to see what happens to Western Europe when the people are freezing. If you start reading stories about people freezing to death, remember a few years ago, people were dying of the heat in France. If we start seeing stories about people freezing to death in Germany, I think a lot of politicians are going to be thrown out of office, and I think anticipating that, we're going to be very tempted to lift sanctions. Okay, Drea.
I think that's what strikes me is Zeihan talks about the cost of transport. So you have piracy threats to transport, and then you have a trade war, and then you have the demographics. But if China and Russia are going to be the new superpowers, but they still ensure cheap transport, if we have trade wars but cheap transport within those rival areas, do you still have the collapse?
Yeah, that's a good question. At one point, he has a statement, and I forget exactly how he puts it, but that, you know, a very small increase in transport costs really causes huge dislocation. And I think that must be true because in a world where we have very fine-tuned supply chains, where you want to make every step in the production process be the cheapest possible, and then if you do that and you're comparing pennies, and then all of a sudden there's a little increase in transport cost, away that goes. And I don't know what we're seeing now in terms of that. I mean, how much, is the typical American large manufacturing firm now, recalculating and recalibrating and saying, okay, we are going to, tighten up the supply chains, or, and make sure that, we'll sacrifice, 5%, we'll be willing to increase costs 5 or 10% in order to have a supply chain that passes over some other part of the, that's not as complicated and not as fragile. That'll be that I don't know about that's going on. But you're asking sort of a separate question about this, regional things, and that's again, Zeihan may be underestimating the effect of price shifts. That is, if we do things that, if America does things that raise prices, at least under the current system regime, for example, by raising transport costs because we're no longer protecting, international waterways. Again, there's adaptation. People respond to price shifts. The where production takes place shifts. The mix of outputs that people want shifts. That's how economics works. And I think there is a tendency for them to underestimate that. I happen to talk to an economist my age who used to work at the Wharton Econometric Forecasting Unit, who's appeared with Zeihan. And he says he's occasionally argued with Zeihan that, like, Zeihan is talking about the price of oil being, $200 one place and $50 in another. He said that, that just doesn't happen. That, between, not just regular arbitrage, but arbitrage at the output level. Different output prices changing, other factors of production changing. So that's, there is a lot of scope for price response and other adaptation, especially as you get out to a longer run. So that's another reason to think that that things won't break apart quite as much as he's saying. It takes a lot to break countries apart. You can't just sort of break them apart in terms of one input or one output. It has to be a whole combination of.
Well, we should note that the U.S. has been thinking Venezuela is falling apart for how many years now? 8 or 9 years, and there's a lot of ruin in a country like Venezuela, despite terrible policies. And I wish Maduro would leave, but Venezuela has not quite fallen apart, and there was hunger, but there wasn't quite mass starvation.
Yeah, no, I think the political science literature is very, very, the international relations literature is very, very skeptical about the efficacy of sanctions. And, at some point, if people notice that sanctions aren't affecting the other country, but they are, uh, creating inflation and other problems domestically, there might be a change. But who knows? I mean, we've had sanctions on Cuba for, what's over 60 years without any effect on the regime. But there's, not much sign of lifting them. Yeah, so you're saying there are always those, you want to elaborate on your point, Lee?
Sure. I was just thinking that like there are always the sort of doomsday folks who will tell you that Venezuela is going to collapse, or climate change has reached a tipping point, or demographics have reached some sort of crisis point. It's very easy for people who are often locked in on a certain thing or trying to advocate for change about a certain thing to then predict the worst. And that's not always the most accurate prediction. Like, I would love to see regime change in Venezuela. It seems like it's a really bad situation there, but the constant predictions of collapse were wrong. I think the constant predictions that if we didn't do a certain thing about climate change by a certain date, then the whole world was going to explode. Like, that was wrong. And it doesn't mean that these aren't serious problems, but the hyperbole can undermine the the credibility, and it can and so when you don't have accuracy, it's very hard for policymakers to figure out the right policy. And I think you could see that in demographics, you could see it in economic growth, you could see it in the response to COVID. I mean, like, hyperbole can absolutely destroy uh, the approach to creating good policy.
Yeah, I think the alignment of sort of the costs of type 1 and type 2 errors, of sort of underrating something and overrating something, as policy issues, is different than the incentives to underrate and overrate. There may be a lot more incentive to overrate than there is relative to the relative cost of the two errors. Probably in the next few minutes, I'm going to cut this off, but I'll take a couple more. John A., you had something?
A theme in your recent blog posts is disorder, and you focused particularly on inflation as a kind of disorder, which makes planning difficult. And you've also made the case that inflation is that there are corner solutions. You either have low stable inflation or high stable inflation, and the switch is complicated. So my question is, Zeihan wrote his book Before Inflation, and it's not one of the main themes. How would you integrate this line of reasoning that you've been developing with his outlook?
I guess, one of my lines is inflation is a supply shock. It in itself is a supply shock because because of the things you mentioned, it makes it harder to calculate, harder to know how to invest, harder to allocate capital, and so on. I think if Zeihan is also right that China has been kind of sustaining its economy with a lot of sort of money printing, and that's eventually going to turn to inflation, we could see a lot of disorder there, and it'll be interesting to see how they would deal with it. My guess is they would probably try to deal with it with price controls, And then I would give you my line that price controls are a worse supply shock than inflation, because you know, on the top of the disorder of the currency losing value, you have the disorder of relative prices not adjusting. So anyway, that might be one way to integrate that. Okay, I think I'm going to end it here. I think that was a good discussion. We didn't. There are plenty of unsettled issues, but there should be, and I think it does show that it's a provocative book, and people who haven't read it yet would profit from reading it. All right, so thanks everybody.
Thanks to all.
Thanks to all. And the Zeihan.com website has a lot of his stuff. That's quite good.
Yeah, he's all over YouTube. You can't miss him. All right, bye.
Bye-bye.